All right. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to have Professor Richard Nisbett with me today. And I'm sure he needs no introduction, but I will provide a general introduction of him. And so, Professor Richard Nisbett is a social psychologist. He is a distinguished professor at the University of Michigan on social psychology. So, he's well known for his work in intelligence research and in cross cultural social psychology and the culture of honor in American South. He's also the author of multiple books intended for general audience, including this one right here, The Geography of Thought, Intelligence and How to Get It, and most recently, his memoir, Thinking. So we'll be talking about that today. But personally, for me, he's been Professor Nisbet, you've been one of the intellectuals that I look forward to, the kind of intellectual that I would like to be someday. So you've been a sort of idol to me. So it, it is an absolute honor to have you with me today. Great to have you, Professor Nisbet.
Right. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yep. So I want to start by talking about the culture of South because I don't know how closely you follow contemporary pop culture, but 2 days back, there was an incident that happened in the Oscar ceremony. So there was this actor, Will Smith, who got enraged by a joke that a comedian made in that ceremony, and he got up and slapped him. So what I was surprised by was the reaction of the people in the aftermath because nothing happened in that event, and one can blame that on sort of elitism, but the reaction of people on social media, the conversation of people who would normally describe themselves as liberal, who are mostly educated, they were sort of celebrating Will Smith because he had sort of saved his wife's honor by through use of violence. And that reminded me of your paper on the American South, where you write about how Southern companies are more likely to hire candidates, who are convicted of crimes that are apparently convicted of crimes related to violence than Northern companies. They're more likely to also, certain newspapers are also more likely to write positively about incidents of where there are the whether it's honor involved. So it's kind of baffling to me why it happens. So can you explain that and why exactly what are the reasons that you think this happens and how it manifests in society?
How, what happens now? The event or the reaction to the event?
The reaction of the culture of honor.
Yeah. Actually, I have to admit that I'm baffled by the whole business. I certainly think you put your finger on something that's crucial to understanding it all, which is that there is a subculture in the US, which I call culture of honor. And basically, it means you cannot insult me or make fun of me or imply in any way that you have power over me without me having to retaliate. And that attitude is characteristic of the US South, and it's characteristic of Black culture in the US. And those are probably related because Black culture in the US is very substantially influenced by Southern culture in general. And I don't know if you want me to go into the historical reasons for why that culture should exist, but it does exist, and it means I'm actually from the Southwest in the US, and the Southwest is part of the culture of honor. And I participate in that unwillingly. I mean, I used to think I was, perfectly standard, nonviolent, anti-violent, liberal. And when I started studying the culture of honor, I realized I've got some culture of honor in me. I mean, I tend to be somewhat sensitive to insults, more so than my northern friends. And a couple of times I've taken substantial risks in doing what I thought was protecting my home. Perfectly idiotic behavior on my part, but stemming from this culture that I'm a part of. So I understand Smith's action. I certainly don't endorse it or feel like he should have done it. But I also understand the people in the US who are not bothered by it, who think it's a not unreasonable kind of behavior.
So is this culture only related to honor, or is this like, how is the attitude towards normal violence in the American South versus the North? Is it similar or is it different?
Is what similar to what?
Normal sort of violence, without, murder, things like that, without
No,
that honor motive.
no, they're completely different things. The homicide rate in the US South for whites only. I'm not talking about any other group, not blacks, not Hispanics, just for non-Hispanic whites. The homicide rate is elevated for that group of non-Hispanic whites, only for crimes that involve an insult in some sense. So it's love triangles, barroom brawls, quarrels between neighbors, the kind of violence that occurs in the context of a crime, of a grocery store or a bank or whatever, that has nothing to do with the culture of honor, and there's no difference in the rates for that kind of violence between the North and the South for whites. So it just comes from the stance that you must not insult me, you must not make it clear that you don't take me seriously, and then to just mention briefly the historical origin of that. The US South was founded by herding peoples, and herding peoples the world over are tough guys. You don't cross them. And there's a very good economic reason for that. You can lose your entire livelihood if somebody lets down the bar on your corral, or somebody can steal your pig or your sheep. It's your livelihood. So the way you make that less likely is to say, don't trifle with me, or you're in trouble.
So I'm thinking, because if we sort of think about it deeply, then it talks about how much culture influences individuals. So sometime back, I was reading up on the psychology of racism in the United States, and I found this picture of a man being lynched, and there was this little girl of 10-year-old, I think, and she was standing there proud among all the other audience, and she was smiling. There was a smile on her face, and she was standing right in front of the body of the man being lynched. So this is an actual photograph. So it's horrifying to think how much this can influence individuals' behavior, and to what extent they can lead people, to what crime they can lead people to go. Do you think that this is perhaps something that happened in Nazi Germany?
Well, yes, I mean, there's certainly a relation to that, but there's no connection between the culture of honor that I was just talking about and the race-inspired violence in the US. I mean, they happen to be much more common in the US South, both of them, but there's very little relationship, in my opinion.
Well,
Race
let me talk a bit about, because I think there could be slight connections, because a lot of the lynchings that were happening to protect the honor of white women,
well,
because
right. You're right. That is a genuine connection. But I think at base, honestly, I can't really give you a good explanation for American racism. I don't understand racism anywhere. I mean, I don't understand it. I mean, yes, white Southerners would have told you that you had to keep Black people down because, but partly because of the risk to white women. I mean, it's such nonsense. I mean, I simply don't understand it, but it's, I mean, the whole idea, the American racism, I'm getting out of my depth here, I should say. This is not the kind of social psychology I do, but there was an element in the racism in the US South that was, to me, similar to the treatment of untouchables in India, but where they were unclean. I mean, that was an attitude of the whites toward the Black. These people are unclean, and you have to stay away from them for that reason. And I honestly can't explain that, except there was a concern about Black people having power, especially in the Deep South. There were very substantial minorities of Blacks in a number of states, and whites regarded themselves as being in conflict for resources with those people. But again, I don't understand it. I mean, the whole thing is so insane. I mean, and I don't understand it wherever. I don't understand Nazi Germany. I mean, it's incomprehensible. The attitude toward the Jews, it's just incomprehensible to me. So.
Well, I think it's somewhat related to your other work on cultural differences between Asians and the Western kind of thinking. So Asians are more likely to, sort of talk about community. They're more community oriented, East Asian mostly, and they're not likely to talk back. So there's a culture of conformity, to put it loosely, versus a culture of individualism. And I'm wondering if some cultures are more prone to accepting authoritarian leaders than other cultures.
Toward accepting what?
Authoritarian leaders.
Oh, yes. I don't know. It's a very interesting question. I think the the only major culture in the world which is almost completely free of tendencies towards supporting authoritarianism is people of Northwestern European culture. Certainly Eastern European culture. I mean, we're seeing the drift toward authoritarianism in lots of Eastern European countries, including, of course, Russia. And even in Southern European cultures, I think there's more sympathy with authoritarianism. But in the U.S., I mean, nearly all of the sympathy for authoritarianism in the U.S. Is in the South and to a lesser degree in the West. Very little of that in the Northeast. And I don't quite understand that. I couldn't give you a good explanation for why the U.S. South should have more sympathy toward authoritarianism, just as a fact.
Is there a culture of conformity there as well? Perhaps is the South more, uh, you know, conforming than the North?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. In some senses, the U.S. South is more inclined toward collectivism, toward interdependence than the rest of the U.S. One of the characteristics of, for example, East Asian style collectivism, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water.
Yeah. All right.
What's characteristic of East Asian collectivism or interdependence is this emphasis on harmony. I mean, the word harmony is extremely commonly used in East Asia. It means get along, be agreeable, fit in with other people. My explanation of that is that it's economic. The large plantation agriculture was characteristic of China forever. And that requires cooperation among people. You can't be effective on your own. You're only effective in relation to other people for your economic well-being. That was never true in the origins of the West, where in Greece there is no plantation agriculture. The activities there are relatively individualistic. They're herding, where you don't have to deal with other people, trading, kitchen gardening, fishing, and so on. So it wasn't important to fit in with your fellow individuals. And by the way, that's my explanation of how logic happened to originate in Greece, and by the way, in India. And I would love to know what part of India logic came into being earliest. Do you happen to know that? I mean, is there a geographical region that's associated with the origin of logic?
Not really. I think it would be probably the South, the Southeast.
Okay. Gujarat?
Yeah,
Gujarati?
yeah, around Gujarat as well.
Right. Wherever you find an argumentative culture, you find logic. That's Greece, that's Jewish culture, where the debates, the rabbinical debates and so on are very common, and in India, and there's a book by Amartya Sen.
Yeah, the
called,
argumentative. Okay.
right. So it's no accident. So South Asia, Greece, and the Jewish Middle East are the centers historically of logic.
So this is connected because you sent me a paper where it was about Asians and leadership, how South Asians are even more likely at times than whites to get leadership positions in American films, while East Asians are not. So I have a tentative explanation for that. I think that even though there are similarities between India, between South Asia and East Asia, in the sense that it is a closely knit community-oriented culture, just like East Asia is. But at the same time, in Indian culture, there's been a strong emphasis on debate. We keep hearing about, even in oral sort of myths and legends, we hear about saints engaging in theological debates. These are referred to as sastratas. There are books, the one of the most popular book in the West is the Bhagavad Gita, which is essentially a conversation, question and answer sort of conversation, kind of a debate between deontological versus consequentialist. And there's figures like Adi Shankaracharya, who is a saint, and he is known for engaging in philosophical debates, theological debates, and he's valorized for using logic to sort of dismantle his opponents, like as it were. So the idea of debate is deeply embedded in Indian culture. So even though it is community oriented, people here are more prone to sort of speak up, especially when it comes to family matter. They're more prone to mock the elders and things like that. They're more prone to express themselves, even though they're not necessarily that well uh, learned, even when they don't have anything valuable to say. So I think it is that culture of debate uh, which is an explanation for the South Asian being more vocal than East Asian.
Yeah, that's plausible to me. It's not, I mean, frankly, I'm not that familiar with what goes on in business corporations to necessarily understand the South Asian success as executives. I tend, what we have evidence for is outspokenness. East Asians, they stand back, they don't, put themselves out there, they're not forceful, they're not, and they're not argumentative. That would be, I mean, the whole principle of harmony says, you don't stand out. I mean, there are East Asian expressions which make little sense to Indians or Americans, like the plant that is the tallest is the one that gets cut down, or the empty wagon makes the most noise. Don't stand out, don't, stand back and that that's effective in East Asian culture. But when you put East Asians in cultures where you need to put yourself out there, you need to be forceful, you need to be willing to intervene, they don't do well. They do fine. They just don't become the head of the organization. It's in my own experience with Indians, which isn't much. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that Indians sort of were not a presence in the US until last week. I mean, it's just suddenly, Indians are heads of corporations, they're leaders of academic movements. They're just very much in evidence. I mean, I don't think sort of in my own campus. I mean, just sort of one day there were no Indians, and the next day they were all over the place. And I don't know. I mean, are Indians aware of the extent to which there's been a tremendous influx of Indians into the U.S.? I mean,
Yes, they are. And I think I'm going to give you a tentative explanation for that. I think it's because of liberalization, which happened around 1991. And that sort of created a new middle class. And because of that middle class, more Indians started, moving on to America. And this is also seen in Indian culture, like in Indian movies. After 1990s, you usually have movies about Indians living in America, and that was essentially a trend up until 2010, right? So I think it was liberalization probably, which you know led Indians to sort of go to US all of a sudden.
led to what?
Led Indians to
Yeah.
have more presence in the United States.
Right. Yeah, so it's very striking. No, I, so anyway, so what other kinds of things did you want to talk to me about?
Right. So I wanted to talk to you about intelligence, of course. I want to talk about hereditarian, but before we do that, I want you to uh, tell me about how you define intelligence, and then we can go from there.
Well, I, that's actually, despite the fact that I've been studying intelligence for decades, I don't have much confidence in my definitions of intelligence. I mean, they're not really different from lay people's definitions. I mean, it's the ability to figure things out, the ability to understand things, the ability to gain knowledge, the ability to learn both from formal education and just from living in the world. So these are, there's nothing professional about my definition of intelligence in that sense. Although lately, I've become interested in the concept of people with high IQs who are foolish, who are not effective, either in some ways or sort of in general. And my exhibit A is Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, of course, is super high IQ person. I mean, when she was in Yale Law School, which is the most distinguished law school in the country, a fellow student of hers once said about her that whenever she answered a question in class, her answers were never good. They were always perfect. So you're talking about someone with extremely high analytic intelligence, and yet someone who was worse than ineffective in the political domain. She was responsible for basically preventing the US from having a government-financed health system because she handled it so badly. She was in charge of it. She made herself in charge of it, and she made a botch of it. And she lost. There are many reasons why Hillary Clinton lost the election to the nomination to Barack Obama and lost the election to Donald Trump. But one of them is she made a comment at some point that half of Donald Trump's supporters were a basket of
Deplorables.
Of
Deplorables.
deplorables. Yes, right. I mean the intellectual failure there is sort of unbelievable. I mean, first of all, I don't happen to agree with her. I think lots of fine folks were Trump supporters, idiotically enough. But to say it, I mean, it's just, but there are, and the person I know with the single highest tested IQ, and unmistakably brilliant. I mean, just could display it all in any number of domains, was never successful as an academic. I mean, we only taught at very undistinguished universities. I mean, he was quite socially inept, and ability to function effectively with other people is very much a part of what anyone would call intelligence. I mean, it's just so. A related point for me is that quite interestingly, that the higher a person's IQ, the more jagged the ability profile. To take myself as an example of somebody who has a fairly high IQ, not terribly high, but fairly high. I have very good analytic abilities in many ways, but my spatial relations ability are very poor. My mental speed is not particularly high. My math abilities are very limited. I mean, it's just and this is characteristic. I mean, there are plenty of high IQ people who are remarkable across the boards with every kind of intellectual ability, but that's not typical. And the higher the IQ, the more there are peaks and valleys of talents. And this is not certainly part of the Western understanding of intelligence. I mean, you've got a lot of it or little of it. It isn't this, there's this basket of skills where you can be very high and not so high at all, or very low and not completely low across everything. But the higher the overall profile, the more jagged the peaks and valleys across subtypes of intelligence.
Do you think the reason certain high IQ individuals don't succeed in particular fields could be because those particular fields maybe require something else that is not measured by IQ? Say, Sternberg would say that politics requires something like practical intelligence, street smartness, perhaps, rather than sort of high IQ.
Yes, very much so. I mean, if you're in a university, a very good university like mine, lots of people whose analytic type IQ is astonishingly high, but who are not effective. I mean, I have had graduate students in seminar that they dazzle. And they can't do a simple study. I mean, go out and find out, what is the case. They can't do it. I mean, it's just, 2 points here. One by a famous physiologist, and the other by a famous investment, the business financial investor, named the latter is Warren Buffett, who's the most successful investor in the US. And he once said, investing is not the kind of game where the guy with the highest IQ wins. He says, if you have an IQ of 160, you might as well sell 30 of those points because you're not going to need them. Something that makes the same point is by the physiologist, early 20th century physiologist named Hans Selye, who said, effectiveness as a scientist, and I would say that's true in any field, is a multiplicative affair. Part of it's raw intelligence, analytical ability, and so on. Part of it is ability to get along with people. Part of it is ambition. Part of it is willingness to work hard. Part of it is curiosity. A part of it is imagination. And you don't have to be extraordinarily high in any of those things in order to be an enormously successful scientist. But none of those things can be zero, because then the whole thing is zero. And I think that's, so you asked me for my definition of intelligence. I'm not very good at a definition, but I think I have interesting things to say about intelligence. So
I'm wondering about that Warren Buffett quote, because it is somehow related to what Malcolm Gladwell wrote in Outliers, and he relied heavily on your work. So his point was essentially that after a certain threshold, those extra points stop mattering. So, someone like 150 IQ and someone versus someone with 180 IQ, it will not make much difference to, predicting their success or their ability to innovate or things like that. So what do you think about that?
Whoops, I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, I asked you about the threshold of IQ that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about, which is that someone with 150 IQ versus someone with 180 IQ, because both IQs are very high. It will really not matter much about those extra points, because after a certain threshold, it stops mattering, and there's no predictive value after that. So what do you make of that threshold point? Do you think it's valid?
Do I think it's what?
Do you think
Valid.
that there is a threshold point?
No, I wouldn't say, no, I don't, I wouldn't say there's a threshold point. I would just say that there's lots of intellectual skills and lots of skills which we think of primarily as social or emotional rather than intellectual, which are important to accomplishment in almost any field. So, I mean, the higher your IQ type skills, the better but it's just, they're just a part of what's needed in order to be effective in any domain. They're not the whole show.
So what do you think about Sternberg's theory of multiple intelligences then? Do you think some of those may be more predictive along with, perhaps taken along with IQ, when you use his ideas of multiple intelligence, they will perhaps be more predictable of success?
Yes, I think Sternberg's work is very consistent with the kind of thing I've been saying. I mean, you see, there are different intellectual skills, and take curiosity, for example. I often, when I give talks about intelligence, I'll ask the audience, who do you think has a higher IQ? George W. Bush or Barack Obama? Now, these are usually asked to liberal audiences. Nevertheless, you might find one or two people who think it's George Bush. I mean, everybody else thinks it's Obama. Actually, we know what their college SAT scores were, and they're very high, very similar. I mean, and SAT scores, scholastic achievement, and college entrance scores are very highly correlated with IQ scores. But even George Bush's aides, the people he dealt with, said the man was remarkably lacking in curiosity or in intellectual drive. Or, I mean, this is a man who in his lunch hour, he spent playing video games. I mean, it was a crummy mind, but IQ was not the problem. It was a lot of other things that we don't think of as being exclusively intellectual or even primarily intellectual. Anyway, so that's, go ahead.
I never thought of George W. Bush as someone with a high IQ, stupid individual. I just simply thought of him as a stupid individual because of his public statements. But of course, that's just first impressions. So what do you think about emotional intelligence? And then I want to move on to heritability.
Well, I guess I believe there's such a thing. I believe it's distinct from IQ type intelligence. There's a very instructive comparison between two types of deficit that one encounters all over the world. One is autism, where people who are autistic. I mean, they simply don't understand human relations. I mean, they don't understand social kinds of events. They don't, I mean, despite the fact they may have high IQs. I mean, so that's one point in favor of Sternberg's view that, I mean, there is a type of social intelligence or emotional intelligence, which is quite distinct from other types, the types that are caught by IQ tests. Then as a totally different kind of syndrome, I can't think of the name of the condition, but it's a very low IQ person. I mean, just extremely hardly testable IQ, who may be socially and emotionally very much intact. I mean, you can relate to them. They're agreeable people, but
Down syndrome?
Down syndrome, that's what I'm after. And they will actually perform better on tests of that involve social skills, social relations, than the high IQ autistic person. So these two extremes, you know, show that there's something to his idea of emotional intelligence. Actually, I'm not sure the emotional intelligence is Sternberg's idea, but it's certainly he would endorse that. I mean,
Yeah, I think it's Goleman, Daniel Goleman, who popularized it.
he popularized it. He didn't invent it. First person who used it actually is a social psychologist who is currently president of Yale University. But he didn't have much evidence about it. He didn't. His gifts were mostly for administration.
Do you think perhaps that the conditions that you talked about, perhaps they're more better explained by the big five personality traits, like neuroticism or things like that, instead of emotional intelligence?
So what is better explained by the big five?
The fact that the autistic people are not as socially agreeable, conscientious.
Right. To me, those are different issues. I'm trying to think, how would you characterize autistic people? You would not, certainly my stereotype of autistic people is that they wouldn't score high on extroversion or agreeableness, or whereas Down syndrome kid might well score well on agreeableness or even extroversion. So these are things that we think of as purely personality things, but are related to the intellectual abilities. Conscientiousness, that's another one. Another kind of thing that contributes to success. Conscientious people are going to be more, other things equal, are going to be more successful than less conscientious people.
Yeah, but conscientious and disagreeable, that I think is a very good combination for predicting success. So I want to talk about heritability, because this is something that you have written about and talked about, especially at his reference to Charles Murray and Bernstein's work. So most people, most sort of educated people, assume that IQ is heritable, that schools don't do much to change intelligence. Is that view correct, or is it does it supported by evidence?
Yeah, well, um, it's incorrect. We've known for a long time, you can't be intelligent in the way that we, modern society, defines intelligence without schooling. It's as simple as that. I mean, so that it would ever have been a part of the IQ, the picture of intelligence, that schooling was irrelevant, it's totally baffling to me. Totally baffling. I mean, the ideology of intelligence, the people who studied it, somehow it very I think it may have something to do with the early studies of intelligence were British, and for some reason, and maybe it's not related to that, but the early intelligence work always assumed that IQ was largely heritable, that it was something that you had sort of as your birthright to one degree or another, and that environmental effects were slight to non-significant, and that includes schooling. Idiotic. I mean, smart people in the field of intelligence believed this for like the better part of a century. And Herrnstein and Murray in their book, The Bell Curve, were tapping into that. They weren't misdescribing, really, the scientific view of intelligence. But what they were describing was foolishness. I mean, and could have been known to be foolish at the time they wrote the book. So Murray is still making claims that that are simply empirically false.
So one of the evidence that he cites in his favor, many people cite, is the twin studies. So what do you think about that?
Well, let me be clear. There is a substantial heritable component to all intellectual skills, including the set of intellectual skills which are measured by IQ tests. Very, very substantial. Now, exactly how substantial, we don't know. That's very technical, but there's certain. I mean, the twin studies are enough to show by themselves that there's a substantial heritable component to IQ. Now, how great that is it's a technical question, but at base, we know that genes count a lot for anything we would want to call IQ type skills.
Do you think the twin studies are perhaps methodologically flawed, or do you think that they're accurate in their reporting?
Well, a huge error was made in the twin studies. They showed that the degree of similarity between identical twins was almost as great for identical twins raised in different environments as they were for identical twins raised in the same environment. And for a very long time, I took that as evidence of very, very substantial heritability of IQ. But it isn't, because the studies have made the error of just including primarily twins who were raised in similar environments, even if technically they were different. They typically were raised in the same community by people of the same social class. So they were identical twins, were similar to one another, in part because of the similarity of their genes, and in part because of the similarity of the environments, which were different, but highly similar in general. And this is a lot of the work that would have shown that Herrnstein and Murray were wrong was done ages ago. I mean, there was a study, someone thought to do the study of, well, let's look at identical twins who were raised in really quite different environments. I mean, not just different, locations or families, but identical twins who are literally placed in settings that are in effect randomly selected to be different. I mean, and the answer is, if you look at identical twin IQ similarity from twins raised in similar environments, that's much higher than the similarity between identical twins raised in highly dissimilar environments. It's so the work was there. It was a single study, and it should be redone. But
it hasn't been replicated.
It hasn't been replicated, to my knowledge, no. But I mean, if you believe that environments matter, and for that there's massive evidence now of the importance of environments. I mean, what happens to the IQ of a kid? You can look at, there's a wonderful study done either in Norway or Sweden where they had IQ data on every male of a given, born in a given year. And they looked at brothers who were raised in, who were adopted by families of upper middle class versus families of lower class, looked at their IQs. And they were hugely different. I mean, and the adoption study, in general, adoption by an upper middle class family versus a lower class family is worth about 12 to 18 IQ points, which is the difference between someone who might graduate from high school or might not versus someone you would expect to go to college. So absolutely massive difference depending on the social class in which these brothers were raised. So that's one of, scads of studies showing the importance of environment. And again, most of the evidence was available at the time Herrnstein and Murray wrote their book.
Well, that's fascinating. So I came across in your book, you write, and these are your words, the degree of heritability places no constraint on the degree of modifiability that is possible. And I don't know how that makes sense. In what sense are you talking about? Like the assumption being that something that is heritable is likely not that modifiable, especially when it's something like IQ. So if we assume that IQ is heritable, then doesn't it make sense to then argue that, well, you can't do much about changing it then, because that's the argument that the hereditarian seems to make.
Right. Yeah, I know that feels like a reasonable conclusion, but it's wrong. And let me here, I can do a thought experiment. You'll realize what's wrong about that. Imagine that you have a handful of seeds and for a plant, and the height of the plant is heritable to some degree. Okay, now we're going to look at the plant's raised in identical environments. I mean, we're going to control the temperature and the moisture and the fertilizer, everything absolutely, completely identical across all of these seeds as they grow up. The height of those plants will differ, and that difference is 100% due to genetic differences. And that's logically the case. That's not an empirical point, right? That's just a logical point. I mean, environments are identical. Any differences have to be genetic, because these are the only two things that can influence any outcome for an organism. Now, let's take a bunch of plants and give them very different environments, ideal nutrition, temperature, but absolutely everything perfect for raising this kind of plant, and raise another kind of plant in a very impoverished environment, not good fertilizer, not ideal temperature, et cetera. There's going to be a very big difference between those plants in their height. Okay. But since we've randomly put seeds in one environment versus the other, we know that all of the difference between plants is due to the environment. It's because heritability has been controlled by random assignment. So any difference has to be environmental in origin. Even biologists will make errors in logic, I mean, because they don't, it's not an error in logic, it's an error from a mistaken understanding. It's the understanding that you expressed and started, gee, well, if something's largely heritable and to that extent, it's not modifiable. Nope, not true. Heritability is unrelated to modifiability. A trait can be enormously heritable, but can be enormously modifiable. And actually, a study that makes this point, or an example that makes this point very clear. Imagine two identical twins. They've got exactly the same genes, and they're placed, they're raised in different environments. They're going to be very similar in basketball playing skill in America. And part of that's undoubtedly genetic, has to do with height and strength and speed and so on. But part of that similarity will also be environmental, because the children will manipulate their environment. They get, both of them, whether they're raised in environments that are where basketball playing is very common, and one is raised in an environment that's not so common, they're both going to be inclined to play basketball because of the degree of which they're skilled in the relevant aspects, and they're going to attract attention from coaches. They're going to be selected on teams, et cetera. And the ones who are not very skilled won't be selected on teams, and they won't be noticed by them, and so on. So the resulting difference in basketball playing skills is partly due to the inheritance, and partly due to the selective aspect of genes on the environment that the person encounters. And if you put a kid in a place where there are no basketball hoops, that kid may have an identical twin who's a basketball star, but this kid is not going to have any basketball playing ability at all. He's never seen a basketball hoop. So that's a useful example, I think, for understanding how environment can be enormously important, even though heritability is very great for a particular attribute. And the
That
same thing for intellectual skills. Two kids, very good genes for IQ. One's placed in a great upper middle class environment that would be very promotive of intelligence. The other kid is placed in a relatively impoverished one. Still, that kid with high genetic predisposition is going to go to the library, is going to attract the attention of teachers, is going to seek out other smart kids to deal with, and so on. So the genes are biasing the environment, and the resulting, what results is both a function of genes and a function of the environment, but they interact with one another. That's another thing.
Well, that's very helpful. And I think that the problem, with the kind of thinking that I posed was probably because we tend to see these two as sort of opposites of each other, nature versus nurture, instead of sort of interactive elements, which is more helpful. So another thing that I want to talk about is race differences in IQ, because this is one of the things that Bernstein and Murray emphasize on in the bell curve, which is that not just that there are racial differences in IQ, but that these racial differences tend to be, for the most part, genetic in origin. So what is the evidence for that?
I'm sorry, say that again.
That most racial differences are genetic in origin.
That most what differences are genetic?
Racial differences are IQ differences in race.
Oh, all right, racial, okay. Yeah, well, let's start by saying there is no direct evidence which gives support to the claim that racial differences are genetic. All of the evidence that people like Bernstein and Murray call on is it's an inferential. I mean, for example, there's no difference in simple reaction time, choice reaction time. Press this lever if that light comes on, press that lever if the other light comes on. There's no difference between blacks and whites in simple reaction time, but if you make it more, the decision more complicated, so that you have to do some thinking in order to do that, then you get a speed difference. So they say, oh, well, that speed difference, that's intellectual ability. And I said, well, that's pretty indirect evidence. It so happens I did a study in which I found blacks and whites, they have the same average simple reaction time, a difference in complex reaction time favoring whites, unless you tell kids that you'll pay them money for how fast they are. And that obliterates the race difference. It's just, black kids are not so is interested in pleasing the experimenter, so they can put the effort into the complex reaction time study. So it's that kind of evidence that it's on the face of it, well, sort of persuasive, but not really direct evidence. But we do have all kinds of evidence that's superior to the kind that the IQ testers were using as support for their view. The adoption studies are the most convincing. I mean, if you, the best single adoption study looked at Black and mixed race kids, that are children of white and black, black mother, white father, for example, raised in Black families versus in white families. There was no difference in middle childhood in IQ uh, between the Black kids and the mixed race kids. But whether the kid was Black or mixed race, the IQ was on average about 13 points higher for the kids raised in white families than in Black families. The environments are very different. If you go into the homes and look at the kinds of activities that you would expect that would make a kid smarter, they're more in evidence in the white families. I mean, that's the whites on average provide better environments that would promote intellectual skills than the Black families in general. So that's a fairly direct test. I mean, genes is making no difference to the outcome. Environment's making a huge difference. So it's a 13-point difference, by the way, which is essentially the whole difference between Black and white IQ that was characteristic at the time the study was done. So, my book is full of examples of pretty fairly direct tests of the importance of environment to that difference. So, there's not in advance a lot. Amazing enough, when I started doing the research, which convinced me and has convinced lots of other people as well, that the IQ difference owed nothing to genes, liberals were annoyed at me. A lot of liberals were annoyed at me for doing the research. And at first I thought, what? Why would you? And because, I don't know, God told them that there could be no genetic difference between Blacks and whites with respect. Well, that was a hallucination. No, because there was no way they could have known it. There could have been a genetic difference between Blacks and whites, but so far as we know, there isn't.
Do you think the Flynn effect has reduced the Black and white gap? And do you see that reason for the Flynn effect is environmental?
Well, the Black-white difference in IQ has reduced itself over the last 70 or 80 years. It used to be 15 points. It's the last time it was examined, to my knowledge, it was more like 10 points, a little less than 10 points. It continues to decline, which is, of course, consistent with an environmental interpretation of the difference. What was the other part of your question?
Well, the reason for the Flynn effect is yet environmental.
Yes, right. I mean, that's the IQ test. I mean, Flynn very cleverly showed that IQ has been increasing for at least in the rich countries, has been decreasing for at least the last 70 or 80 years. There's good reason to believe it goes back much further even than that. Some of the very first studies were done in Russia, looking at the thought processes of uneducated peasants. And they seem to us to show people who are incredibly stupid. I mean, you would say to such a peasant, as you know, in the North, all bears are white. And then a little bit later, you'd say to the person, I have a friend who lives in the North, and he wrote me a letter recently, and he told me that he saw a bear in his neighborhood. What color do you suppose it was? And the person would say, what? I don't know. I asked your friend who saw the bear. I didn't see the bear. There is a mental construction in the heads of all educated people now. If P, then Q. P is the case, therefore Q is the case. It's just automatically. We don't know we're doing that, but we do it. And it comes with the territory for education. Flynn tells a wonderful anecdote about his father, who had not even a complete grade school education. And his father was incapable of applying, that's the logical construction there, is modus ponens, if P then Q. His father was incapable of that. His father was incapable of hypothetical reasoning or counterfactual reasoning. So you might say to his father, well, how do you think you would feel about that if you were a woman? And the father said, well, that's ridiculous. I'm not a woman. I couldn't be a woman. I mean, he's just incapable of constructing a mental picture that would allow him to answer that question. So that's Flynn's father. Flynn, by the way, is the guy with an 180 IQ. This is his father, who seems like a moron to us. And Flynn's son is professor of pure mathematics at Oxford. So, education matters to how smart you can be.
And surprisingly, one of the things that surprised me was the Venezuela study that you cited, and which if talked about interventions in schools that reduced IQ by 6 points, and it was authored by Richard Bernstein, of all people.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that.
The Venezuela study that you talked about in your book, authored by Richard Bernstein, which reduced, which implemented changes in the school education system and reduced 6 points IQ.
Right. Yeah, there are a number of stories like that, which make no sense in terms of the mistaken view of heritability of IQ. My favorite one is in 1970, a British IQ researcher wrote a book which, to his satisfaction, showed that Black IQ was lower than white IQ by 15 points for genetic reasons. The evidence was ridiculous in the book. But this same psychologist said, and by the way, the difference between the English and the Irish is also about 15 points. And here's his explanation for that. He said, well, Ireland had the famine, and the Irish with any brains got the hell out of the country, went to a country where there was food, leaving only the stupid people there in Ireland. It happens that around the same time, Ireland made a huge push for improving education across the levels of education, but especially for post-high school education. So what we would call in the US community college education, junior college, which taught skills that are highly employable. Today, Irish IQ is higher than English IQ. And Irish per capita GDP is higher than English per capita GDP. So score one for environment. It's very compelling to us, but to see we see someone make correct judgments about their intelligence, and it just seems to be so clearly a manifestation of something internal to the person, and we don't see the environmental contribution to that. We can't. It's invisible to us.
So I'm wondering, your point of view, is it supported by the current sort of niche intelligent researchers? Because when the bell curve came out, there was a there was a paper in the Wall Street Journal signed by sort of mainstream experts on intelligence, basically endorsing the conclusions and science of that book. So I'm thinking, what is the mainstream view of researchers on intelligence at the moment?
You know, you would think I would know the answer to that question. I don't really. I do know that after several years after I wrote that book, I wrote an article which appeared in a major psychology journal where Flynn was on intelligence. Sort of, here's what we know about intelligence today. Flynn, who's a big contributor to the study of intelligence, of course, and the most distinguished genetic psychologist who studied intelligence, and the very distinguished developmental psychologist who studied intelligence. And we laid out basically the case for environment, how important environment is to intelligence, and contradicted the received opinion about the importance of heritability. And that's never been contradicted. That paper came out in 2011, 2012. There's been no response. So I take that as weak evidence that the received opinion in the IQ field has changed. I mean, one of the dyed-in-the-wool, typical IQ researchers who is today the editor of Intelligence, he was very much of the opinion that was that Herrnstein and Murray presented. He read the paper, and we asked him to read it. Could he find anything wrong with it? No, he couldn't. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that everybody in the field agrees with us and now with him, but I'm going to take it as evidence that the field has changed.
But probably, I think that one of the reasons I had this view about the hereditarian view previously, more on the nature side than the nurture side, was because of books on evolutionary psychology, because that presented a sort of dichotomy between nature versus nurture. And it used to, well, Steven Pinker, whom I otherwise admire, in his Blank Slate, wrote essentially about Murray summarizing the study, but he never, talked about the criticism. So what the impression that I was getting from reading these books was that, well, these people are disinterested scientists and they're being maligned because of political reasons, right? And this is the impression that, Sam Harris had as well. But after reading your work and Professor Turkheimer's work, my views have sort of changed because I've been introduced to new evidence. So well, thank you very much for that, first of all. And I know I've taken a lot of your time, but I do wanted to ask you about how to increase IQ, the interventions that you would recommend, the policies, recommendations that you have, which perhaps would increase IQ and intelligence and success rate among different countries.
Right. Well, you might think I would have some firm opinions about that. I don't really. I don't. I mean, you can point to things because the evidence here is correlational. I mean, it's except for, we know how important school is because there are accidents that produce differences in how much schooling people have. And the beautiful work was done by Stephen Ceci on what's the effect of school on a kid's IQ. And because in the US, if you're born before a certain day, you can start first grade. If you're born the next day, you have to wait a year. So that's, and of course that's random. I mean, that's random assignment to school or not having school, because I was born on August 21st, I get school. I was born on August 27, I don't get that. And 1 year of school is about the equivalent, has about the same effect on IQ as 1 year of age. And of course, you know, IQs keep going up with age, but you get an extra year of IQ by virtue of going to school. So we know that school is crucial. I mean, some of the early work, again, it's, I don't want to seem too anti-British here, but the work was done by the British psychologists, showing that there was a test called the Raven's progressive matrices, and you show people shapes of various kinds. They're changing along a certain dimension, and you have to figure out what that dimension is. So you're showing them circles and squares and triangles, and everybody's seen those things, and you're showing them the changes, and people have to infer what the principle is that's causing these changes. And that was treated, it was billed as a culture-free IQ test. Because everybody's seen circles and squares, and how well you can make inferences must be culture-free. That test is totally dependent on culture. I mean, you can't solve that kind of problem if you haven't had some formal education. One study done with African kids, 8 or 9 or 10 years old, with no formal schooling, did terribly on that test. If they had a couple of 3 months of formal education, they got 10 points higher IQ. So it's the test is completely dependent on skills, which we have by virtue of having certain kinds of environments.
I'm wondering, because you talked about schooling, so I'm wondering how much of do you think there should be like similar schooling systems across countries, or should we like have different schooling systems and different learning methods in order that are more culturally sensitive, perhaps, because maybe East Asians learn better in a different way, South Asians learn better in, you know, more in a different manner. So do you think we should have different schooling systems? Like, is that something that you're talking about?
I'm largely ignorant of educational research of the kind you're asking about there. I mean, I'm not sure that there's much in the way of good research that would answer your question. I mean, education is really very similar across all the rich countries. I mean, it's I mean, take one study that was done quite a while ago, looking at first grade kids before the first grade and kids after the first or second grade of schooling, looking at IQs in a large American city, a large Chinese city, and a large Japanese city. And Now, comparing IQ across cultures is obviously a problem. I mean, how can the test be the same if it's in Japanese versus English? But, and in fact, prior to the first grade, the American kids had slightly higher IQ than the Chinese or Japanese kids, which makes sense if you know what the socialization is. Americans socialize for intelligence. I was once on an airplane where there was a father of like maybe a 4-year-old kid who was quizzing his son. He said, pajamas, Billy, are pajamas long or short? And Billy says, short. No, pajamas are long. This would be a bizarre activity for an East Asian parent. We're much more concerned with emotional socialization. So I say, here's a truck. See, I give it to you. You give it to me. Yes, thank you. And you show them how pleased you look. That's bizarre for an American parent to do that. I mean, it's just so the very different socialization, and a lot more of it is keyed toward intelligence for Americans than for East Asians. After a year of school, there's no difference between the East Asian kids and the American kids. However, the East Asian kids are distinctly ahead in arithmetic. I mean, much better. There seems to me, I mean, this what I'm about to tell you is not data, it's just an impression that math is much better taught in East Asia than in the US.
It's more, probably it's more emphasized upon in Asian cultures in the United States.
It probably is, but I mean, American education, in Japan, it's understood that a teacher doesn't really become fully effective until they've been doing it for 10 years or so. In the US, we give them a few weeks in a classroom when they put them into a school and nobody's checking they monitor each other. They they critique each other in Japan. And that doesn't happen really. The principal might stop in and look occasionally at what's going on. They're not very serious in the US about math education. And a part of it has to do with these false ideas about cognitive skills. I mean, you've either got it or you haven't. I mean, there's an anecdote in my book where I say in fifth grade, I started not doing great in math. And my parents said, well, don't worry, Nisbets have never been much good at math. I was very happy to have the alibi, but no East Asian parent would say that. Even if it was the case, they say, the Chow family have never been very good in math, but damn it, you're going to be good in math. And they, because I mean, Americans believe that math ability is, of course, math ability is partially genetically determined, but it's also decidedly, importantly influenced by environment, by teaching. So at any rate, East Asian kids were way ahead. And in the US, I don't know if you're aware of the lawsuit that's going on against Harvard University. East Asian kids of East Asian background are overrepresented at Harvard by a factor of 4. They're about 4% of the population. They're about 16% of the undergraduate population at Harvard. And there is an association of East Asians who are suing Harvard for not admitting enough East Asians because whites, not to mention blacks and Hispanics, are getting admitted with lower grades and lower college entrance exam grades. And my answer to that, by the way, is, well, IQ is not the whole show. That's not the whole business. If they were ever asked to be a witness in that trial that of the suit against Harvard, I would say, well, IQ, my vulgar way of putting it is IQ and a subway token will get you into town. It's very important, there's no question, but it's not the whole show. And actually, the study that I just did, looking at the difference between South Asians, whites, and East Asians, makes that point. I mean, South Asians have got talents, whether you want to call them intellectual or not, but they have talents which cause them to be successful in domains we care a lot about, which are not purely IQ. They don't have any higher entrance scores in business school or law school than East Asians or whites, but they do better than East Asians and at least as well as whites.
Well, I think that's, as strange as it sounds, most people do not have that mindsets, and I'm sure that people. I got to learn a lot from you today. So thank you very much for doing this, and you've been one of my inspirations, one of my heroes, and I cannot emphasize this enough. It was an absolute honor talking with you. Thank you,
Thanks.
Professor Nisbett.
I had a lot of fun, as it should be clear.